A terrified mother clutches her husband's hand, her heart racing as she waits to see her daughter again. A brave officer stands silently, carrying the weight of a case that has shaken an entire city. What unfolds next will leave everyone speechless. When Officer Jamal Carter cracked open a dangerous trafficking ring, he uncovered a nightmare no one could imagine. The case wasn't just about justice. It was about saving lives like little Emily's, whose face haunted him every night. But as he pieced together the puzzle, the true scale of the operation revealed something far more sinister. What he discovered in those shadows changed everything. This isn't just a story of bravery. It's a fight for innocence that will stay with you forever. Before we dive deeper into this gripping story, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, Epic Story Moments, yet, now is the perfect time. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update, and be the first to hear our incredible news stories. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support more heartwarming tales like this. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. The quiet hum of the patrol car engine blended with the stillness of a suburban evening, broken only by the occasional crackle of the radio. Officer Jamal Carter had been on the force long enough to know that quiet nights often held their own secrets. His shift so far had been uneventful, a string of mundane patrols that lulled him into a false sense of routine. But something about this night felt different, as if the stillness was waiting to break. As Jamal turned a corner, his headlights caught the faint movement of a car rolling through a stop sign at a nearby intersection. It was a minor infraction, one that usually signaled a distracted driver or someone in a rush to get home. Still, a stop sign was a stop sign, and Jamal wasn't the type to let it slide. With a flick of his wrist, his patrol lights illuminated the dark sedan ahead. The car slowed and pulled over to the shoulder, its driver compliant but calm, too calm. Jamal parked behind it, his mind running through the possibilities. A hurried commuter, a teenager testing boundaries, or maybe just an innocent oversight. He radioed in the stop, his tone steady and professional, before stepping out into the cool night air. As he approached the driver's side window, the sedan's polished exterior and clean lines gave little indication of trouble. The window rolled down smoothly, revealing a man in his late 40s with neatly combed hair and a pressed button-down shirt. His smile was warm but practiced, like someone used to putting others at ease. "Good evening, officer," the man greeted, his voice calm and measured. "Is there a problem?" Jamal's eyes swept over the interior of the car. In the back seat sat a little girl, no older than 7, clutching a worn doll to her chest. Her blonde hair framed a pale, delicate face, but it was her eyes that caught his attention. Wide and unblinking, they seemed to silently plead for something. Her small frame was stiff, her posture unnaturally rigid, as though she were trying to disappear into the seat. "You ran a stop sign back there," Jamal said, keeping his tone neutral. "In a rush tonight?" The man chuckled nervously. "I apologize, officer. It's late, and I guess I wasn't paying attention. Just trying to get home. License and registration, please." The man handed over the requested documents without hesitation. "Stephen Blake," he said smoothly, "and this is my daughter, Emily. We've been at my sister's house for a late family dinner. Emily's wiped out, as you can see." Jamal glanced back at the girl. Her faint smile seemed forced, her movements mechanical as she nodded in agreement. Her hands gripped the doll tightly, her knuckles white. When Stephen turned to glance at her, Jamal noticed the smallest of flinches, a barely perceptible recoil that sent a chill through him. "Emily, huh?" Jamal said, addressing the girl directly. "You doing okay back there?" Her smile faltered, just for a moment. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost drowned out by the hum of the engine. "She's just tired," Stephen interjected quickly, his tone overly casual. "It's been a long night, you know how it is." Jamal nodded but didn't reply. His instincts, honed by years on the force, were screaming at him. Something about the girl's demeanor didn't add up. The stiffness, the avoidance of eye contact, the subtle tension in her body. And then there was Stephen, his calmness too calculated, his responses too quick. "Where's home?" Jamal asked, probing further. "Meadowbrook Lane, just outside of town," Stephen replied, his tone smooth and confident. Jamal glanced at the license and registration. Everything checked out. The address matched, and Stephen Blake had no prior violations. On paper, he was a model citizen, but the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, despite the cool night air, didn't escape Jamal's notice. "You seem like a nice family man, Mr. Blake," Jamal said, his tone conversational but edged with subtle suspicion. "Not every day you see a father and daughter out this late." Stephen chuckled hollowly. "Yeah, well, family dinners can run long sometimes. But family's important, you know." Jamal forced a polite nod. "Of course. Just a heads up, though, make sure you come to a full stop at signs. It's for everyone's safety." "Absolutely, officer. Won't happen again," Stephen replied, his smile remaining firmly in place. Jamal stepped back, reluctantly signaling the end of the stop. "All right, you're good to go. Drive safe." "Thank you, officer. Have a good night," Stephen said, his voice unwavering as he rolled up the window and drove off. Jamal watched the sedan disappear into the darkness, unease coiling in his chest. The girl's haunted eyes and rigid posture stayed with him, refusing to fade. His gut told him something was wrong, deeply wrong, but without clear evidence he couldn't act. He returned to his cruiser, his mind racing, and jotted down the license plate number in his notebook. Back at the precinct, the usual buzz of activity was subdued, the night shift buried in paperwork or out on patrol. Jamal settled at his desk, the faint hum of fluorescent lights above doing little to quiet his thoughts. He opened his notebook, staring at the string of numbers he had written. 4A3X992. The image of Emily, clutching her doll as though it were her lifeline, lingered in his mind. Jamal leaned forward, entering the plate number into the state database. The search results confirmed what he already knew. Stephen Blake of Meadowbrook Lane. No prior arrests or citations. On the surface, everything was in order, but appearances could be deceiving. Jamal replayed the dash cam footage from the stop, scrutinizing every detail. The stiffness in Emily's posture, the slight flinch when Stephen glanced at her, the way her smile never reached her eyes. Each detail deepened the pit in his stomach. He didn't know what Stephen Blake was hiding, but he was determined to find out. Something about that night wouldn't let him rest. Jamal sat in the dim glow of his office, his eyes glued to the computer screen as the dashcam footage played back. His heart tightened as the sedan came into view, the man's face briefly illuminated by the patrol car's lights. The driver's forced smile seemed overly eager, almost rehearsed. Something about him didn't sit right. Jamal fast-forwarded to the part where the little girl, Emily, came into focus. He froze the frame on her blank, expressionless face. Her wide blue eyes darted around nervously, as if searching for a way out. As Jamal studied the footage, he noticed something subtle, barely perceptible at first. Rewinding and leaning in closer, he saw it. Emily's lips moved ever so slightly as she clutched her doll. He replayed the clip multiple times, slowing it down frame by frame until he caught it clearly. Her lips formed two words: "Help me." The realization hit Jamal like a thunderbolt. His chest tightened as he sank back in his chair, staring at the screen in disbelief. She had tried to communicate, her quiet plea slipping under the radar, unnoticed in the moment. It all clicked into place. This wasn't just an odd encounter. It was something far more sinister. Jamal's fingers flew over the keyboard as he reopened the driver's records. Stephen Blake. The name wasn't new to him. He'd run it earlier during the stop. This time, he expanded his search, broadening it across state lines. As reports flooded his screen, a disturbing pattern emerged. Stephen's name appeared in multiple cases. Suspicious behavior around children, interviews connected to missing minors, and even an anonymous tip about a man leaving a park with a child who later vanished. There wasn't enough evidence to charge him in any of those cases, but Jamal didn't need a conviction to see the truth. Wherever Stephen went, children disappeared. His stomach churned as he opened a new tab and searched the latest Amber Alerts. One report matched Emily perfectly. Emily Harper, age 7, blonde hair, blue eyes. She had been reported missing 3 days ago from a playground in Ridgefield, 50 miles away. Witnesses described seeing a man in a dark sedan near the playground shortly before Emily vanished. Jamal's pulse raced as he leaned back, connecting the dots. Emily wasn't Stephen's daughter. She wasn't heading home from a family dinner. She was a missing child, and Stephen Blake was her abductor. He slammed his fist on the desk, frustration mingling with panic. He had let them go. He had watched them drive off into the night. His instincts had screamed at him that something was wrong, but without solid proof, he hadn't acted. Now, Emily's life hung in the balance. "Damn it," Jamal muttered, grabbing his radio. "This is Officer Carter. I need an APB on a dark sedan. License plate for A3X992, registered to Stephen Blake. Possible abduction case. The child matches an active Amber Alert. Notify Ridgefield PD and coordinate immediately." The dispatcher's calm but focused voice crackled back. "Copy that, Officer Carter. Sending out the bulletin now. Stand by." Jamal paced the small precinct office, his mind racing. He couldn't just wait for backup. Time was slipping away. He pulled up a map of the area, tracing possible routes Stephen might take. The man's listed address was on Meadowbrook Lane, but Jamal doubted Stephen would risk going there. He had been too calm during the stop, too calculated. Someone operating in the shadows as long as Stephen wouldn't make such an obvious mistake. He thought back to Emily, her silence, the way her tiny hands clutched the doll, her whispered plea. It all painted a picture of fear. She wasn't just quiet. She was terrified, trying not to provoke the man who had taken her. Jamal typed up a detailed report of the traffic stop, attaching the dashcam footage. He flagged it for Detective Laura Mills, his trusted partner. Laura had experience coordinating with multi-agency task forces, and Jamal knew she would act fast. But he couldn't wait for bureaucracy to grind its slow wheels into motion. Grabbing his jacket, Jamal headed for the door. His resolve hardened with every step. He didn't know where Stephen was, but he'd figure it out. Emily's frightened face haunted his mind. Her whispered, "Help me," McCall he couldn't ignore. As he stepped into the cool night air, his radio crackled. "Officer Carter, this is dispatch. Ridgefield PD confirms the Amber Alert. They're requesting coordination. Task force en route to Meadowbrook Lane to check the address." "Copy that," Jamal said, already sliding into his cruiser. The engine roared to life as he peeled out of the parking lot, the weight of the situation pressing on his shoulders. Every empty road, every quiet suburban street felt like a labyrinth, somewhere in the dark. Stephen was out there, and Emily's time was running out. Jamal dialed Laura on his car's Bluetooth, his grip on the steering wheel tight. She answered on the second ring, her voice brisk. "Jamal, what's going on?" "I stopped the sedan earlier tonight. Driver's name is Stephen Blake. There was a girl in the back, blonde, about 7. Something fell off, but I let them go. Turns out she matches an Amber Alert for Emily Harper. Missing from Ridgefield 3 days ago." Laura's voice sharpened. "You let them go?" Jamal winced at her tone, but pressed on. "I didn't have anything solid at the time, but now I do. Stephen Blake has a history, linked to child abductions, though nothing stuck. He's our guy. Send me everything, plates, address, footage. I'll loop in the Ridgefield task force. I already did. I'm on the move now. I don't think he's going home, but I'll follow every lead. Be careful, Jamal. Don't do anything reckless." Jamal's jaw tightened. "I'll bring her back, Laura. I have to." The quiet streets blurred past as he sped into the night, his mind locked on one goal: finding Emily before it was too late. Every instinct screamed at him that he was running out of time, but he wouldn't stop, not until he brought her home. Jamal's instincts told him something was off. Stephen Blake was smart, too smart. The predator had eluded authorities for years, his movements as calculated as they were sinister. Jamal's grip tightened around his phone as Sarah's voice came through, calm yet urgent. "He knows the heat's coming," Sarah said, her tone steady but laced with determination. "If he's planning to move her, we don't have time to wait. Let me pull up his file and look for patterns. Any known family, associates, or favorite places to hide." "I'm on it," Jamal replied, his fingers flying over his laptop keyboard. "But this guy's slippery. He's been linked to similar cases across multiple states, but nothing ever sticks. He's a ghost. Always one step ahead." "Not this time," Sarah said firmly. "Meet me at the precinct in 20. We'll map out a plan and coordinate with Ridgefield." "On my way." Jamal ended the call and floored the gas pedal, the weight of his failure pressing heavily on his chest. At the precinct, the tension was palpable. Jamal and Sarah combed through Stephen Blake's file, every detail a frustrating reminder of how elusive he had been. Stephen had been questioned in numerous states, always in connection with missing children, but he had never been charged. He was meticulous, careful, and maddeningly good at covering his tracks. "He's got a pattern," Sarah muttered, scrolling through the digital records. "He targets public spaces, parks, playgrounds, anywhere kids might wander off. They disappear for a few days, and by the time anyone's close, he's long gone." Jamal leaned over her shoulder, his jaw tight. "Not this time. We're going to find him." Sarah glanced at him, her expression softening. "You're taking this personally." "Damn right I am," Jamal said, his voice low but intense. "I had her, Sarah. She was right there, and I let her go. That's on me. I'm not letting it happen again." Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Beating yourself up won't help. We need to think like him. If he's planning to move her, where would he go? What's his next move?" Jamal exhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus. "He's been at this for years. He doesn't take risks. He probably has a predetermined location. Somewhere secluded, somewhere he knows he won't be disturbed." Sarah nodded, her fingers flying over the keyboard. She pulled up a map of the area, marking key points of interest. "His address on Meadowbrook Lane is a long shot, but we'll have units check it. Beyond that, motels, rest stops, and any isolated properties are our best bets." "Ridgefield," Jamal said, his eyes narrowing. "If he took her from there, he might still have a connection to the area." Sarah's phone buzzed. She read the message aloud. "Ridgefield PD just flagged an old hunting cabin about 30 miles out. It's owned by Stephen's uncle, but hasn't been used in years." Jamal grabbed his jacket. "I'll check it out." "I'm coming with you," Sarah said, grabbing her car keys. The drive to the cabin was tense, the narrow, unpaved road twisting through the darkness. When the dilapidated structure finally came into view, it looked like it could collapse at any moment. Jamal and Sarah parked a distance away and approached on foot, flashlights cutting through the inky blackness. "Dispatch, this is Detective Mills," Sarah said into her radio. "We're at the location, proceeding with caution." The cabin's windows were boarded up and the front door hung ajar. Jamal's heart pounded as he pushed the door open. The air inside was thick with dust, the furniture coated in cobwebs. It was clear no one had been there in years. "Nothing," Sarah muttered, frustration creeping into her voice. Jamal clenched his fists, the weight of time slipping away, pressing down on him. "We're running out of options." "We need to regroup," Sarah said. "Think back to where you stopped him. People like him don't stray far from their comfort zones." The neighborhood where Jamal had first pulled Stephen over was eerily quiet. Porch lights flickered weakly, casting faint halos onto the cracked sidewalks. Jamal knocked on doors, his badge in hand, hoping someone had seen something. Finally, an older woman cracked her door open, peering at him cautiously. "I'm Officer Carter," Jamal began. "I'm investigating a missing child case. Have you seen a dark sedan earlier tonight? White man driving, little girl in the back seat? The woman frowned, thinking back. I think I did. It was parked right there, she said, pointing to the curb. The driver kept looking around, like he was checking if anyone was watching. Did you see where they went? No. But the little girl looked scared. Poor thing. Jamal's pulse quickened. Thank you. If you remember anything else, please call. His radio crackled to life as he returned to his cruiser. Officer Carter, we received a tip from a diner waitress south of your location. She saw a man matching Stephen Blake's description with a young girl. They appeared agitated. Jamal gripped the mic. What's the address? The dispatcher provided the location, a roadside diner off the highway. Jamal's GPS guided him there, every second stretching into an eternity. Inside the diner, a young waitress described Stephen and the girl. She had a doll, she said softly. Looked scared. Jamal's gut twisted. They were close. Where did they go? He asked, his voice sharp with urgency. He left heading north, she replied. Jamal's mind raced. Stephen was running out of places to hide, and Jamal wasn't about to let him disappear again. Jamal Carter couldn't shake the memory of Emily Harper's wide, fearful eyes as she disappeared into the night with Stephen Blake. The gnawing sense of failure haunted him, propelling him forward even as exhaustion threatened to drag him down. His resolve solidified as he stood in the empty parking lot of the gas station where Stephen had last been seen, piecing together the predator's calculated moves. The young attendant inside, startled by Jamal's sudden appearance, glanced up nervously from his phone as Jamal approached the counter. Jamal held up his badge, his voice steady but intense. Evening. I'm Detective Carter. I need to ask you about a man who may have come through here earlier tonight. White male, mid-40s, driving a dark sedan with a young girl about 7 years old. Did you see them? The attendant hesitated, his brow furrowing in thought. Yeah, I think I did. It was a couple of hours ago. The guy filled up his tank, grabbed some snacks. The girl dropped her doll on the way out, and when she bent to pick it up, he snapped at her, called her stupid. He paused, unease evident on his face. She looked scared, but she didn't say a word, just grabbed the doll and got in the car. Jamal's stomach churned. He could picture Emily clutching her doll, trembling under the weight of Stephen's oppressive presence. Which way did they go? He asked, his voice sharper than he intended. The attendant pointed toward the southbound highway. They turned on a Pine Street, headed that way. Jamal scribbled the details in his notebook and handed the attendant his card. If you remember anything else, call me. Stepping back into the cool night air, Jamal leaned against the hood of his cruiser, his thoughts racing. The girl wasn't just a victim. She was a ticking clock, her life hanging by a thread with every second that passed. As if on cue, his radio crackled to life. Detective Carter, this is dispatch. A diner waitress just reported seeing a man matching Stephen Blake's description. He appeared agitated and mentioned something about needing a place to stay. Jamal straightened, adrenaline surging through his veins. Send me the address. The dispatcher relayed the location, a roadside diner just off the highway. Jamal threw the car into gear, tires screeching as he sped toward the lead. The neon glow of the diner's sign pierced the darkness as he approached, its flickering light casting eerie shadows across the lot. Inside, the smell of coffee and fried food mingled with the low hum of fluorescent lights. A middle-aged waitress with tired eyes and a name tag reading Linda straightened as Jamal entered. You must be the officer, she said, her voice weary but firm. I called about the man with the little girl. Jamal nodded, his focus unshaken. Tell me everything you saw. Linda leaned against the counter, her expression grave. They came in about an hour ago. He ordered coffee and a burger. The girl, poor thing, just sat there, clutching her doll and staring at her plate. He snapped at her to act normal when she fidgeted. It wasn't right. Did he say anything about where he was headed? Jamal pressed. Linda nodded. He was on the phone at one point, talking about needing a place to stay. There's a motel just down the highway, the Lakeside Inn. It's a dump, but it's close. Jamal's pulse quickened. Did he seem like he was in a hurry? Not exactly, Linda replied, frowning. But he kept checking the door, like he was worried someone was watching. Jamal handed her his card. Thank you. If you remember anything else, call me immediately. Linda's voice followed him as he left. Find that little girl, detective. She didn't look safe with him. Outside, Jamal radioed Sarah. I've got a lead. Stephen might be at the Lakeside Inn, just off Highway 7. I'm heading there now. I'm already en route, Sarah replied. Meet you there in 10? The drive to the motel felt like an eternity, every second stretching as Jamal's mind raced with possibilities. The Lakeside Inn loomed ahead, its flickering sign casting a dim, sickly glow over the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. The building was as decrepit as Linda had described. Peeling paint, broken porch lights, and an air of neglect. Jamal parked beside Sarah's unmarked car at the far end of the lot. She rolled down her window, her expression as tense as his own. The clerk confirmed it, she said. Stephen's car is here. Room 12. He checked in about 30 minutes ago, and the girl's with him. Jamal's fist clenched, his jaw tightening as the image of Emily's terrified face resurfaced. We can't wait. He's dangerous, and she's running out of time. Sarah nodded, her tone resolute. Let's move. They approached room 12 with their weapons drawn, their footsteps silent on the cracked pavement. The faint glow from the room's single lamp seeped through the curtains, casting ominous shadows inside. Jamal's heart pounded as he signaled to Sarah, his breath steadying as they prepared to breach. This time, he wouldn't let Stephen Blake slip away. The air was thick with tension as Jamal Carter's instincts kicked into overdrive. He froze mid-step, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Emily's small figure crouched ahead in the clearing, her face buried in her knees. But behind him, the ominous sound of a knife being readied sent a chill down his spine. Jamal didn't turn immediately. He knew that any sudden movement could provoke whoever was behind him. Instead, he spoke, his voice calm but commanding. Whoever you are, let's not make this worse for yourself. Drop the weapon and we'll talk. The reply came as a low, raspy laugh, one that sent the hairs on the back of his neck standing upright. You're out of your depth, officer. Walk away now, and I might let you live. Jamal's mind raced. He calculated his options carefully. His hand hovered near his holster, but he didn't draw his weapon yet. He needed to de-escalate and protect Emily, who was still too close to the danger. You're making a mistake, he said, shifting his stance slightly to keep Emily in his peripheral vision. The little girl doesn't need to be part of this. Let her go. Behind him, the figure moved closer, their steps deliberate and heavy. You don't understand, do you? She's mine. You should have stayed out of it. In one swift motion, Jamal spun around, his flashlight's beam slicing through the darkness. The light landed on a rugged, wiry man, his face partially obscured by a hood. In his right hand, he held a hunting knife, its blade glinting ominously. The man's eyes were wild, a mix of anger and desperation. Jamal kept his voice steady, though his pulse thundered in his ears. It's over, Stephen. Drop the knife. You're not walking out of here with her. Stephen Blake sneered, his grip on the knife tightening. You think you can stop me? You're just a cop. I've been running my whole life. You have no idea what I'm capable of. Jamal didn't flinch. He took a cautious step forward, his hand still near his holster. You're right, Stephen. I don't know your past, but I do know this. Hurting Emily isn't going to fix anything. It's not too late to end this without anyone else getting hurt. Behind Jamal, Emily lifted her head slightly, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. She clutched her doll tightly, her small body trembling with fear. Stephen's eyes flicked to the girl, and Jamal seized the opportunity. In a single practiced motion, he drew his weapon, pointing it directly at Stephen. Drop the knife now, he barked, his voice slicing through the tense silence. Stephen hesitated, his breathing ragged. His gaze darted between Jamal and Emily, weighing his options. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out, but then his shoulders slumped, and he let the knife fall to the forest floor with a dull thud. Jamal kept his weapon trained on Stephen as he reached for his radio. "This is Officer Carter. Suspect is in custody. Request immediate backup at my location." Stephen sneered, his defiance still smoldering beneath the surface. "You think this is over? You'll never keep me locked up. I'll be out before you know it." Jamal ignored him, his focus shifting to Emily. He knelt down, his tone softening as he spoke to her. "Emily, it's okay now. You're safe. I'm here to help you." The little girl hesitated, her wide eyes filled with uncertainty. Slowly, she let go of her doll and reached for Jamal's outstretched hand. He lifted her gently, shielding her with his body as he escorted her away from Stephen. By the time backup arrived, Sarah was already on the scene, her face a mix of relief and determination. Together, they secured Stephen in the back of a patrol car. Jamal handed Emily over to a paramedic, ensuring she was safe and receiving the care she needed. As Stephen was driven away, his threats fading into the night, Jamal finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. He looked toward the woods, now eerily quiet, and then back to Emily, who was being comforted by a medic. Despite the night's chaos, he felt a sense of resolve. Emily was safe. Stephen was in custody, and though the scars of the ordeal might linger, Jamal knew they had done everything in their power to bring justice and protect the innocent. The night was thick with tension, every second stretching into eternity as Jamal and Sarah huddled in the shadows outside the motel. The dim glow from a partially drawn curtain revealed Stephen pacing inside the room, his movements erratic and restless. Little Emily sat on the edge of the bed, clutching her doll as if it were her only anchor in a storm. Her tiny shoulders hunched, her small frame trembling under the weight of fear. "Jamal," Sarah whispered, her voice low and firm. "We can't rush in. If we make the wrong move, he might hurt her. We need to wait for the right moment." Jamal's jaw clenched, every instinct screaming at him to act. But he nodded, his eyes never leaving Emily. Together, they watched and waited, the minutes dragging on as Stephen's behavior grew more agitated. He muttered to himself, gesturing wildly, a ticking bomb ready to explode. Finally, Stephen grabbed a pack of cigarettes and headed for the door. Jamal tensed, his heart pounding as he whispered, "This is it." Stephen stepped onto the porch, a cigarette dangling from his lips, oblivious to the officers lurking in the shadows. The instant he lit the cigarette, Jamal sprang into action, moving swiftly and silently. In a heartbeat, he had Stephen pinned against the wall, the cigarette falling to the ground. "Stephen Blake," Jamal growled, his voice steady but seething with controlled fury. "You're under arrest for the abduction of Emily Harper. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Stephen writhed in Jamal's grasp, his voice a mix of panic and defiance. "You've got it all wrong. She's my daughter. Save it," Sarah snapped, stepping forward to cuff him. "We'll sort it out downtown." But just as relief began to settle over them, a noise from the woods behind the motel shattered the moment, a rustling sound that made Sarah's hand instinctively move to her weapon. "What the hell was that?" she muttered, her eyes scanning the tree-line. Jamal motioned for her to stay with Stephen. "I'll check it out," he said, his voice low but resolute. Before he could move, Emily darted out of the room, her small figure disappearing into the darkness of the woods. "Emily!" Jamal shouted, his voice slicing through the night. He started after her. But another faint shadow caught his attention, a movement at the edge of the trees. The forest loomed ahead, a shadowy labyrinth shrouded in an eerie stillness. Jamal plunged into its depths, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was damp, the earthy scent of wet leaves and soil clinging to him as branches clawed at his uniform. "Emily," he called, his voice firm yet gentle. "It's Officer Carter. I'm here to help you. A faint whimper reached his ears, barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. He froze, his flashlight sweeping the underbrush. Every rustle, every whisper of wind felt like a threat. "Stay where you are," he urged, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at him. But the sense of being watched grew stronger with every step. Suddenly, the beam of his flashlight caught movement. A figure crouched near the base of a tree. Emily. Relief surged through him as he moved toward her, but a heavy footfall behind him brought him to an abrupt halt. Jamal turned just in time to see a blade glint in the faint light. A man emerged from the shadows, his face obscured by a hood. His stance was low and predatory, his intent unmistakable. "Stay back," Jamal commanded, positioning himself between Emily and the attacker. The man lunged, the knife slicing through the air. Jamal sidestepped, swinging his flashlight with precision and knocking the weapon from the man's grip. But the fight was far from over. The attacker shoved Jamal against a tree, the impact sending pain radiating through his back. "Run, Emily," Jamal shouted, his voice strained but firm. "Go now." The girl hesitated, her wide eyes darting between Jamal and the fight. "Go," he repeated, desperation sharpening his tone. Emily bolted, her small figure vanishing into the woods. Jamal fought with everything he had, grappling with the man on the forest floor. Twigs snapped beneath them, dirt clinging to their clothes as they wrestled for control. Jamal managed to pin the man down, securing one wrist with a cuff before the attacker thrashed wildly, raking his nails across Jamal's arm. Pain flared, but Jamal didn't relent. He twisted the man's arm, securing the second cuff with a decisive click. "Who are you?" Jamal demanded, hauling the man to his feet. "Why are you helping him?" The man sneered, his silence a defiance that only fueled Jamal's resolve. Blood trickled down Jamal's arm, but he ignored it, his focus solely on Emily. Emerging from the woods, he found her waiting near a tree, clutching her doll tightly. "Emily," Jamal said softly, crouching despite the searing pain in his arm. "You're safe now." The girl hesitated, then ran into his arms, her tiny frame trembling as she clung to him. Jamal lifted her, holding her close as they made their way back to the motel. Sarah met them halfway, her weapon drawn as she secured the accomplice. "You okay?" she asked, her gaze flickering to Jamal's bloodied arm. "I'll live," he replied, his focus still on Emily. "Let's get her out of here." Back at the precinct, Stephen Blake sat in the interrogation room, his smug expression faltering as Sarah slid a picture of Emily across the table. "This is Emily Harper," she said, her tone icy. "She was abducted 3 days ago. Care to explain how she ended up in your custody?" Stephen's smirk wavered, the cracks in his facade beginning to show. Jamal stood outside the room, watching through the glass. Emily was safe, but the fight for justice was far from over as the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Jamal knew this was only the beginning of uncovering the truth. The cold, sterile air of the interrogation room seemed to amplify every sound. The faint hum of fluorescent lights, the clinking of cuffs against a metal table, and the soft scrape of a chair being shifted. Stephen Blake sat slouched in his chair, his hands restrained, his expression defiant. A faint, mocking smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth, a feigned bravado that barely masked the tension lurking beneath. Across from him, Detective Sarah Mills sat with unwavering focus, her sharp eyes piercing through his facade. "You're wasting your time," Stephen drawled, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Emily's my daughter. You're all going to look real stupid when you figure that out." Sarah leaned forward, her hands clasped in front of her on the table, exuding calm authority. "Emily Harper," she began coolly, sliding a photograph across the table, "is 7 years old. She was abducted 3 days ago from her front yard in Meadowville. Her parents are frantic. Care to explain how she ended up in your car?" Stephen's smirk faltered ever so slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "I already told you," he replied, leaning back with an air of nonchalance. She's my daughter. We were just passing through town, family visit. You know how it is. Without a word, Sarah flipped open a folder and retrieved a copy of Emily's birth certificate, placing it next to the photograph. Here's the thing, Stephen. We've already confirmed her identity with Meadowville PD. Her parents provided DNA samples. Emily has been positively identified as their daughter. She paused, her gaze sharp and unrelenting. So, I'll ask you again. How did she end up in your car? Stephen's mask of confidence cracked, his jaw tightening. He looked away, his cuffs clinking as he shifted uncomfortably. Look, he said finally, his tone hardening, you've got it all wrong. I didn't abduct anyone. She came with me willingly. Sarah's calm demeanor shattered. She slammed her hand on the table, the sharp sound echoing through the small room. Enough with the lies, she snapped, her voice rising with fury. You've been caught, Stephen. The girl is terrified of you. She didn't come willingly. She's a child, and you're nothing but a monster who preys on kids. The sooner you admit it, the better. Stephen's face darkened, his smirk fading entirely. You don't know what you're talking about, he spat. You think you're so smart, but you have no idea what's really going on. Sarah leaned in closer, her voice low and icy. Then enlighten me. In the adjacent observation room, Jamal Carter stood behind the one-way mirror, his hands clenched into fists. His entire body radiated tension as he watched Stephen through the glass. Every fiber of his being screamed to storm into the room, to demand answers, to make Stephen pay for what he had done. But Jamal knew better. He couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. Emily was safe now, and his job was to ensure Stephen and his accomplice faced justice. Taking a steadying breath, Jamal turned his attention to the table behind him. It was covered with evidence collected from Stephen's motel room. Forged documents lay in neat piles. Birth certificates, driver's licenses, and custody papers, all meticulously crafted to make it appear as though Stephen had legal guardianship of Emily. There was a stash of passports, each bearing the names and photos of different children, none of whom matched the names listed. But the most chilling discovery was a ledger, its pages filled with coded entries and monetary amounts. A grim catalog of transactions that pointed to a child trafficking operation. This guy has been doing this for years, Sarah had said when the evidence was first uncovered. And he's not working alone. Back in the interrogation room, Sarah wasn't letting up. Her voice was sharp and cutting as she laid the evidence bare. We found the passports, Stephen, dozens of them, all for children who aren't yours. And the ledger? It paints a pretty clear picture of what you've been up to. Stephen's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. You're part of a trafficking ring, Sarah continued, her words slicing through the air like a blade. You abduct children, forge documents to make it look like they're yours, and then sell them. How many kids have you done this to, Stephen? How many families have you destroyed? Stephen's composure finally shattered. He slammed his fist against the table, his face contorted with rage. You don't know anything, he shouted. You think you're some kind of hero, but you don't understand how this world works. Those kids... Don't, Sarah interrupted, her voice cold and unwavering. Don't you dare try to justify this. These are children, not commodities. You're done, Stephen. We've got enough evidence to bury you and your accomplice. Stephen leaned back in his chair, his chest heaving. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He knew the walls were closing in. Outside the interrogation room, Jamal paced back and forth, the weight of the case pressing heavily on his shoulders. He couldn't stop thinking about Emily. How small and fragile she had seemed as she clung to him in the woods. She was safe now, reunited with her parents. But the thought of how close she had come to disappearing forever made his stomach churn. Sarah stepped out of the interrogation room, her face a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. He's not talking, she said. At least not about the bigger operation. But we've got enough to charge him with Emily's abduction, and at least a dozen other counts based on the passports and forged documents. Jamal nodded, his jaw tight. And the accomplice? Sarah sighed, not saying much either, but the evidence ties them both to the same ring. It's a start. It's not enough, Jamal said, his voice low. There are more kids out there. We need to take this operation down. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. We will, she said firmly, but we have to do it the right way. Rushing in without a solid case could blow this wide open and let the real players walk free. Jamal took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. She was right. As much as he wanted to act, they needed to build an airtight case. One that wouldn't just take down Stephen and his accomplice, but the entire network they worked for. Later, as Stephen was led out of the precinct in handcuffs, Jamal stood by the entrance, watching silently. Stephen's smug demeanor was gone, replaced by a sullen, defeated expression. Behind him, the accomplice followed, his hood pulled low over his face. Jamal's chest tightened as he thought of the ledger. The names and photos of children who hadn't been as lucky as Emily. He promised himself he wouldn't stop until every one of them was found. Inside the precinct, Emily sat with a child psychologist, her tiny hands clutching the doll she had held onto throughout the ordeal. Jamal watched from the observation room, his heart heavy but resolute. She was here, alive and safe, because he hadn't given up. And as her parents rushed in to embrace her, their tears of relief filling the room, Jamal felt a quiet sense of triumph. But his mission wasn't over. Not until every child in that ledger was rescued. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment to breathe, knowing that he had made a difference, and that he wouldn't stop until justice was served. The child psychologist's room was quiet, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of what Emily had endured. The small girl sat on a chair, clutching her doll tightly, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of wariness and hope. Jamal Carter stood outside the room, his gaze fixed on her through the observation window. For a moment, he let himself breathe. She was safe. She was alive. But the journey was far from over. Claire and Michael Harper, Emily's parents, waited anxiously in the hallway. Claire's face was pale, her eyes rimmed red from days of crying, while Michael's stoic exterior barely hid the storm of emotions within him. When Jamal approached, Claire sprang to her feet. "Is she okay? Can we see her?" she asked, her voice trembling. "She's okay," Jamal said gently. "She's with a child psychologist, but she's ready to see you now." Claire let out a sob, covering her mouth with her hands. Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his voice thick with gratitude as he said, "Thank you. Thank you for bringing her back to us." Jamal nodded and motioned for them to follow. As they walked down the hallway, Claire quickened her pace, her maternal instinct driving her forward. Jamal opened the door and stepped aside, allowing them in. Emily's eyes lit up the moment she saw her mother. "Mommy!" she cried, abandoning her doll and running into Claire's arms. Claire dropped to her knees, clutching her daughter tightly. Tears streamed down her face as she murmured, "I've got you, baby. I've got you. You're safe now." Michael joined them, wrapping his arms around both of them. "We're never letting you go," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Jamal watched from the doorway, his throat tightening. In his career, he had seen the darkest sides of humanity, but moments like this reminded him why he chose this path. The raw emotion of the family's reunion was a testament to the resilience of love and the unyielding bond of family. As the Harpers composed themselves, Emily turned and walked over to Jamal, her small steps deliberate and brave. She tugged gently on his sleeve. "Officer Carter," she said softly. Jamal crouched to her level. "Yes, Emily." She hesitated, then threw her arms around his neck, whispering, "Thank you for saving me." Jamal froze, overwhelmed by the innocence and sincerity of her words. Slowly, he returned the hug, his voice barely above a whisper as he replied, "You're very brave, Emily." She smiled at him, a small, tentative smile that hinted at the hope of healing. Later, in his office, Jamal stared at the evidence laid out before him. Forged documents, fake passports, and a ledger that mapped a horrifying operation. He clenched his jaw, the weight of responsibility pressing heavily on him. Sarah Mills entered, setting a cup of coffee in front of him. "You okay?" she asked. Jamal exhaled deeply. "I should be. Emily is safe. That's what matters. But it's not enough," Sarah finished for him, her tone serious. He nodded. Stephen and his accomplice are just the tip of the iceberg. That ledger, those names and transactions, it's a blueprint of something much bigger. We have to stop it. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "We will, but we need to do it right. If we rush, we risk letting the masterminds walk free." Jamal's determination hardened. "I won't let another child go through this. No matter how long it takes, we'll take this entire operation down." The courtroom was packed, the air electric with tension. Journalists filled the back rows, ready to document every moment. Stephen Blake sat at the defendant's table, his once smug expression replaced by a hollow stare. His accomplice sat beside him, visibly nervous. Jamal sat in the gallery, his arm in a sling from injuries sustained during the case. He hadn't wanted to be here, but he needed to see it through. The judge's gavel brought the room to silence as the jury filed in. The foreman stood, clearing his throat. In the case of Stephen Blake and Matthew Carson, we find the defendants guilty on all counts, including kidnapping, conspiracy, and child trafficking. A collective gasp filled the courtroom, followed by murmurs of relief. Emily's parents embraced, tears streaming down their faces. Claire whispered, "Thank God," over and over. Jamal exhaled, his chest tight. It wasn't over, not yet. There were more children, more families waiting for justice. But this was a start, and he wouldn't stop until every child was safe. As he stepped outside the courthouse into the cool evening air, Jamal looked up at the sky. The fight wasn't over. But for Emily and her family, a new chapter had begun, a chapter filled with hope, healing, and the promise of a brighter future. Claire sat in a quiet room, her heart pounding in her chest. The psychologist's words replayed in her mind. "She's ready to see you now." Tears welled in her eyes as she turned to Michael, who was beside her, his hand gripping her shoulder tightly as if anchoring her to the moment. His voice, though strained with emotion, was steady. "Thank you for bringing our little girl back to us." Officer Jamal Carter gave a slight nod, his expression professional but touched by the scene before him. "Follow me," he said, his tone soft yet firm. As they walked down the hallway, Claire's steps quickened, her maternal instincts pulling her toward her daughter. Her heartbeat roared in her ears as Jamal pushed open the door. Inside, Emily sat on a chair, clutching a doll tightly. Her tear-filled eyes met Claire's, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Then, Emily dropped the doll and ran toward her mother, crying, "Mommy." Her voice was a mixture of relief and desperation, breaking the heavy silence. Claire fell to her knees, her arms wrapping tightly around her daughter as sobs racked her body. "I've got you, baby. I've got you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Michael joined them, wrapping his arms around both of them, his own tears streaming down his face. "We've got you, sweetheart. You're safe now. We'll never let you go." From the doorway, Jamal watched the reunion, his throat tightening. Over the years, he had witnessed countless heartbreaking scenes. But this moment was different. It was raw, unfiltered, and deeply human, a reminder of why he had dedicated his life to this work. As the family began to compose themselves, Emily's tear-streaked face turned toward Jamal. Her small frame moved cautiously toward him, her doll dangling from her hand. Gently tugging on his sleeve, she said in a soft voice, "Officer Carter." Jamal crouched down to her level. "Yes, Emily." She hesitated before wrapping her tiny arms around his neck. "Thank you for saving me," she whispered, her voice full of innocent gratitude. For a moment, Jamal froze, overwhelmed by the weight of her words. Slowly, he hugged her back. "You're very brave, Emily," he said, his voice barely audible. As she pulled away, she offered him a small, hesitant smile, the first glimmer of hope he had seen in her since this ordeal began. That smile, fragile yet powerful, stayed with him long after the family left the precinct. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The investigation into Stephen Blake's operation had unveiled a horrifying network of child trafficking spanning multiple states. Evidence recovered during the case led to a series of raids, each resulting in arrest and the rescue of more children. Every success reminded Jamal of why he had chosen this path, even as the memories of Emily's terrified face haunted him. One day, Detective Sarah Mills burst into his office, a file in hand and excitement in her voice. "You're not going to believe this," she said, placing the file on his desk. "Another bust last night, 3 arrests and 4 kids rescued." Jamal flipped through the file, the faces of the rescued children stirring a mix of emotions in him. "Good work," he said, his voice subdued. Sarah studied him. "You should be proud, Jamal. This case wouldn't have broken open without you." Jamal shook his head. "It's not about me. It's about those kids, Emily and all the others. They're the ones who matter." Weeks later, on a rare day off, Jamal found himself at a quiet park near his neighborhood. The sound of children's laughter filled the air, a stark contrast to the memories he carried. As he watched the kids play, he was reminded of what he was fighting for. Moments like this, where innocence and joy could thrive. "Officer Carter," a familiar voice called out. Jamal turned to see Claire Harper holding Emily's hand, with Michael following close behind, carrying a picnic basket. Emily's face lit up as she broke into a run. "Officer Carter," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him. Jamal smiled warmly, kneeling to meet her. "Hey, Emily, how are you?" "I'm good," she replied, her voice full of energy. "Mommy and Daddy take me to the park now, and I'm starting school soon." "That's wonderful," Jamal said softly. "You're a brave girl, Emily." Claire approached, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "We can never thank you enough for what you did. You saved our little girl." Michael nodded. "If there's ever anything you need, anything at all, just ask." Jamal stood, his expression humble. "You don't owe me anything. Just keep being the amazing parents you are. That's all Emily needs." Claire hugged him briefly, her voice thick with emotion. "You're a good man, Officer Carter. Don't ever doubt that." As the family walked away, Jamal watched them, a small smile on his face. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. Emily was safe, her family whole. For now, that was enough. That evening, back on patrol, Jamal drove through the city streets, the orange glow of the streetlights casting long shadows. His eyes scanned every corner, every face, every movement. He knew danger could strike at any moment, but he also knew the power of a single act of courage. One choice, one moment of bravery, could change everything. For Jamal, that knowledge was enough to keep going.